A few years ago, my brother would get a call on his cell phone around 2 to 3 a.m. every night. He would answer, and it was this hellish sounding noise, like static mixed with screams. He changed his cell number after a month of this and it stopped. Then after a week or so it began again, the exact same noise, exact same time, and finally one day he decided to back dial the call. It was an old man that had no clue what he was talking about, and still, the calls persisted. If he didn't answer, it would call a few more times, and no messages were left. He decided to say screw it, ended his contract with his phone company, switched to a new one, and then got another new number. And you guessed it, the screaming static calls continued after a short delay, and by this time he was terrified every night. Unsure why this was happening, he back dialed the number again and got a different person. Around the time he lost his job and his phone, the calls stopped, of course. His phone was disconnected now. So one day, my mum asked me to listen to this weird message she got on her home phone. It was a static screaming. We showed my brother and he was freaking out. He back dialed the number again, and it said the number was disconnected this time. Never heard from it again after that. This happened to a friend of mine. She told me about it a year ago. We'll call her Sarah. Sarah is in her late 20s and works as an English tutor in South Korea. And one evening, a few years ago, she was tutoring a high school boy. They were up studying pretty late, and the buses stopped running by that time. Being a long way from his house, the boy asked if he could crash on the floor overnight and get the first bus back in the morning. Sarah was very reluctant, because inviting a teenage male student to stay the night didn't sound like a great idea, but he was begging her, and eventually she relented. They went back to her one-bedroom apartment, and she got into bed, while he laid a blanket out on the floor, and they both fell asleep. A few hours later, at maybe 2 a.m, the boy wakes Sarah up. I'm really hungry, he says. Let's go get some food. Sarah opens her eyes and looks up at him in disbelief. Food? Now? It's 2 a.m. Go back to bed. But the student insists. No, I'm hungry. Let's eat something now. She tells him that there's some ramen in the kitchen and he can fix himself some. This doesn't satisfy him, and he doesn't want ramen. There's a 24-hour place just down the road. Let's go there, he said. Eventually, after several minutes of persuasion, the boy gets Sarah to come with him to the restaurant. They leave the apartment and head out. As soon as they're on the street, the boy turns to Sarah and says, I'm not hungry. I woke up in the middle of the night and looked under your bed. There's a man sleeping under there. They call the police and discover a homeless man had been living in Sarah's apartment, sleeping under her bed for over 2 months. The boy only saw him because he was lying on the floor and had a clear view underneath the bed. The police arrested the man, and thankfully there were no other issues. But that's by far the creepiest thing that's happened to anyone that I know. A few weeks ago, my girlfriend and I were sleeping together when I woke up to her saying, "What are you doing?" She sometimes talks in her sleep, but this sounded so coherent and urgent that it jolted me awake, and I asked what she was talking about. She then woke up and said she thought she saw someone at the end of the bed. Thinking it was just a dream or semi-awake hallucination, we thought nothing of it and went back to sleep. About an hour later, I woke up and saw someone standing on the bed with the sheets wrapped up and twisted around their neck. I didn't know what to do, but the first thing that came out of my mouth was, "What are you doing?" My girlfriend then woke me up. I'd been dreaming the exact same thing she did, and she said the exact same thing. I know it's the power of suggestion or whatever, but fuck that. My grandfather died last year sometime when my son was maybe a year old. We had dinner with the whole family every Friday night, so my son had seen him several times. My grandfather was a very quiet, proud man, but when he thought he was alone or unseen, he would make silly faces at my son to get a laugh. A couple of nights after his funeral, my son, who liked to crawl into bed with us in the middle of the night, started just laughing uncontrollably at like 2 a.m. So I get out of bed to see what's going on and find my son sitting in the middle of the living room in the dark, laughing. I say, "Hey buddy, what are you doing?" He says, "Papa funny." I got a little nervous for some reason and went to pick him up and bring him to our room for the rest of the night. And as I'm hauling him away, he says, "Bye Papa," and blows a kiss at absolutely nothing I can see. When my son was about 3, he had an imaginary friend in his room who he used to talk to all the time. He would tell us stories about things she would tell him, and we'd hear him chatting to her at bedtime, and we thought it was pretty cute at the time. After a few months, my son said he wasn't friends with her anymore, so we figured he was out of his phase of seeing her, so we were surprised to still hear him talking to her at night. Then he started not wanting to go to bed, and started having really bad dreams. At some point, we ended up asking a lot of questions about her. We had assumed she was a little girl, but apparently she was 47 years old. She lived in the wall, and he stopped being friends with her because she wanted him to call her Mummy. I think he said her name was something like Margaret, or something else along those lines. And she wanted him to come live in the wall with her. He had told her he didn't want to talk to her anymore, but she wouldn't go away. We eventually moved house and he stopped talking to her altogether. Funny thing is, when I was pregnant with him, living in the same house, I used to have dreams about a lady sitting at a dining table in our bedroom. Except it was obviously a different era, and the room was not a bedroom at the time. The lady used to knit and make me listen to her giving me parenting advice, while her 20-ish-year-old sons sat at the table quietly. One of my mum's friends bought an old farmhouse about a year back, and they have a 3-year-old son. The kid had an imaginary friend named Kevin, and he would play with his toys in his room and talk to Kevin. His parents didn't really think anything of it considering the age of the kid. It got weird after they started listening to their son's conversation with Kevin over the baby monitor. It seemed like something a 3-year-old wouldn't regularly talk about. The kid was kinda goofy, so they didn't think much of it. They asked the kid about Kevin. He said Kevin is nice. He's a farmer. And they figured it was just because the kid loved to play with toy tractors, and they just moved into the farmhouse. Then shit got real. There was a shelf mounted on the wall of the kid's room that was about 5 feet off the floor opposite the bed. One morning, the parents go into the kid's room to find one of the stuffed animals that had gotten onto the shelf of the kid's bed. They asked him how he got the rabbit. The kid said that Kevin got it for him. A few months passed and shit like this happens every now and then. Nothing that could be reasonably explained. Since they moved in, they had found a church in the area and got involved in Bible study with a few other couples from the church. They decided that they would like to Bible study one day. When they were setting everything up, they gave the address to one of the couples that they lived in the town for a while. And when they gave the address to the older couple, the wife looked at the husband and said, "Hey, isn't this Kevin's old place?" Apparently a man named Kevin used to live there, and he ran into some financial troubles. He sold most of his land to the neighbouring farm, but kept the small patch of land that the house was on. He suffered from depression and had a bit of a drinking problem, and eventually hung himself in the house. Their friends from church knew Kevin, as it's a small town in Iowa, and everyone knows everyone. He found a picture of Kevin and gave it to my mum's friend. The picture was of Kevin and 3 of the guys that Kevin would meet with to have coffee and shoot the shit about farming. They showed the kid the picture. The kid pointed at Kevin and said, "Hey look, it's Kevin." And they eventually moved house shortly after. When I was younger, my family was extremely poor, and we lived in a very old mobile home on some land that my grandpa owned. This piece of land was in a very small town out in the middle of nowhere, Texas, and was covered in woods. The town itself was your typical small country town where football was king, and there's nothing to do but get drunk or high on the weekend. And it was also the type of town, along with it being the early 90s, where one didn't typically have to worry too much about locking the doors or setting an alarm. Now, our trailer was 2-bedroom, and my parents, always putting us kids ahead of themselves, slept in the living room or on the fold-out couch. My room was directly connected to it, and my sister's room was down the hallway past the kitchen, and the bathroom was at the other end of the trailer. One night, after everyone had gone to bed, my dad is woken up by the feeling that someone's in the room. He looks around a bit and sees a large male figure sitting in the easy chair just a feet from the bed. My dad quickly flipped on the light switch next to his bed and saw it was a neighbour from down the road named Carter. Carter was known to be a frequent drug user and was often in trouble with the law because of this. My dad asked him what the fuck he was doing here and told him to get out, and he responded, I can't get out. The demons are chasing me and your house is the only safe one. My dad, who I should know is a fairly large and terrifying person, responded that if he didn't get out and get out quickly, the house would be a lot less safe for him. If I leave, they'll get me. They've been chasing me all night, and if they catch me, I'm dead. My dad's response was that there was no demons, but if he didn't get the fuck out of his house, that he'd be dead. From what I've heard, since I was also asleep for this part, my mum also issued a few threats, and while she's not that big, she was equally as terrifying. I believe it was her anger that finally scared him off. My dad got up and locked the door and watched through the blinds as Carter decided, since he couldn't outrun the demons, he'd steal our old beat Suburban that my dad always left the keys in. He drove around for about half an hour, and we called the police, and it took them as long to get out to us, since the closest police station was 20 or 30 minutes away. He finally brought it back and he was arrested and taken to jail, and he was deemed crazy and ended up locked up in a mental institution. The scary part is that for years later we'd get these phone calls where all we'd hear is music, and it would just be the lyrics, "I'm going to fucking kill you." These calls lasted for years and followed us from house to house, even though we'd always had different numbers and we'd be in different states. We always thought it was him sending us a message. The call stopped when I was about 12. I later found out that it was around the time that Carter thought it the best thing he could do for himself was soak himself in gasoline and set himself on fire. About 4 years ago, I was sleeping and woke up randomly to see a person standing next to my bed. And this person was clearly female, but very petite, perhaps a teenager or just tiny in stature. She was facing away from me into the corner and had her shoulder cocked up to her cheek, like the way you sometimes see people holding phones. Her hair was in a low ponytail. There was nothing surreal or ghostly about her. She appeared exactly as you would imagine a person would, if you were to waken in a dark room, somewhat illuminated by moonlight. There was no mistaking the fact that someone else was standing only a couple of feet away from my bed. I jolted upright immediately. Shock is putting it mildly. I remember my heart was pounding, pounding, pounding. And the worst part about it was, she heard me sit up and reacted, turning her crooked head around to face me, as if equally surprised to see me as I was her. I was so scared I actually closed my eyes, like they do in the movies, thinking that when I opened them she'd be gone, and I would chalk it up as some kind of half-dreaming state. It didn't happen. She was still there staring at me, and I started to fumble for the lamplight on my nightstand. It felt like goddamn forever, but I couldn't take my eyes off her. I was so nervous that the noise would further prompt her to come towards me or something, and when I finally switched it on, she was gone. I called my boyfriend, hysterically crying and begging him to come over. He refused and said I hadn't actually seen what I thought I'd seen. I slept with the light on for 3 entire weeks, I was so scared. I remember I told my mum the next day, and she advised me to search every closet in my apartment for squatters, which is perhaps even more terrifying than a ghost appearance. Thanks, Mum. My school's library is open until around 2 in the morning for the idiots like me who don't do their essays until the last minute. It's a pretty small building and most of the books are in the basement area called the stacks. Just to give you a quick layout, there's a big main stairs that go down to the stacks, a vending machine room, and a long hallway with 4 entrances into the stacks. The stacks are 2 really big rooms on opposite sides of the hallway, with a huge amount of bookshelves and study desks lining the walls. I was there around 11 PM last year. It was a pretty research-intensive essay, so I was down in the stacks working on one of the study desks so I didn't have to keep going upstairs and down again. I'd been there for maybe 2 hours, and everyone except for a boy working a few desks down from me had left already. And I was pretty zoned out by this point. It was an 8 AM class, so I didn't have much time until it was due, and I was sort of panicking. So it really pissed me off when I heard someone flipping through book pages really fast to make them do that loud whirring noise. I sort of ignored it while thinking they'd go away eventually, but it was on the other side of the room, and they just kept on doing it. After about 5 minutes I got sick of it and started to walk over to tell them to knock it off. And I get about 3 steps across the room and it just stopped. I sat back down and it was quiet again for like 10 more minutes before the flipping pages noises started again, only loads louder, like they'd grabbed a huge book this time. The boy started to get pissed off too and stood up and started walking towards the bookshelves trying to find them. It keeps going, so I got up too and started looking around with him. It got really loud and it's pretty obvious where it was coming from by that point, so we started walking towards it. He was on one side of the shelves and I was on the other. We walked all the way down the shelves and no one was there. We hadn't seen anyone come into the stacks, and we were on the one side of the room with both the entrances, so no way anyone could have come in without us seeing them. The noise stopped again, and we both just slowly walked back to our seats. I assumed it was just a fan or something in the other room, and I really needed to get my essay done. We sat down and immediately the noise started again. It sounded like it was coming from right next to the guy's chair. He shoved his stuff in his bag, looked at me, and said, "Fuck this," and took off. I was out there maybe 5 seconds behind him. I still won't go back into the stacks at night, even when there's other people down there. No essay's worth getting murdered by a weird book ghost.